Hello everyone, welcome back to Fact Finder. Today we have a story so surreal that you might think it's science fiction, but believe me, it's 100% real. We're talking about an event so extreme that it defies logic, science, and even human nature. Just imagine, you're caught in a brutal snowstorm, the temperature plummets below 30 degrees Fahrenheit, and for 6 long hours, your body's completely frozen. Most people wouldn't stand a chance, but Jean Hilliard not only survived, but emerged from this experience without a single scar. It sounds like a Hollywood movie script, right? But this extraordinary story really happened, and today we're going to dive into the details of this incredible survival journey. Get ready to hear every detail of how Jean Hilliard defied all odds and conquered the impossible. The beginning of the adventure. It was December 20th, 1980, a night Jean Hilliard would never forget. At just 19 years old, she went out with friends to enjoy a quiet evening in rural Minnesota, USA. The plan was simple, a few hours of fun, and then everyone would head home. But what seemed like an ordinary night quickly turned into a nightmare scenario. Something even in her worst dreams, Jean couldn't have imagined. As they drove back home, Jean and her friends were caught by a devastating snowstorm. The gusts of wind hurled snow in every direction, creating a white wall in front of the car. The temperature was falling rapidly, and the cold began to penetrate not just their clothes, but their bones. The car's engine, unprepared for such extreme conditions, started to show signs of failure. The heat that should have warmed the inside of the vehicle wasn't enough to combat the ice accumulating outside. Feeling the tension rise with each passing minute, Jean tried to maintain control of the car, but the roads were slippery and treacherous. Visibility was nearly zero, and the snowstorm made it seem like they were in an endless tunnel of ice. Then, in a moment of desperation, the car skidded off the road and came to a halt in a rural ditch. Jean's heart raced. They were stranded in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by worsening cold. The engine finally gave out, leaving the car stopped with no heat and no sign of help in sight. Alone in the car, Jean knew she needed to act quickly. The cold was becoming unbearable, and she couldn't just sit there hoping the car would miraculously start. Looking around, she tried to spot any landmarks or lights that indicated a house or shelter nearby. Remembering a friend who lived in the area and believing that his house was close, she decided that the best option was to leave the car and walk there, braving the snow and cutting wind. Little did she know, what lay ahead was a test of endurance few could withstand. The fatal decision. With her heart racing and the cold beginning to paralyze her movements, Joan made a decision that seemed to be her only option. She believed her friend's house was nearby, perhaps just a few minutes away on foot. Leaving the car seemed like the best choice. After all, the idea of waiting there, motionless, while the intense cold invaded the inside of the vehicle was terrifying. So with determination and a touch of desperation, Joan stepped out of the car, ready to face the snowstorm on foot. But Joan underestimated the relentless force of nature. What she didn't know was that she was over 3 kilometers away from her destination. 3 kilometers might seem like a small distance under normal conditions, but in the midst of a brutal snowstorm, each step felt like a monumental challenge. Dressed inadequately for the extreme cold, with only a few layers of clothing that barely retained body heat, Jane began her journey. The dense fog enveloped everything around her, making it impossible to see what was just a few meters ahead. The cutting wind made the snow hit her face like tiny needles, and the darkness was so deep it seemed to swallow any hint of light. With each step, the cold seemed to penetrate deeper into her bones, slowly draining her energy and willpower. Despite this, Jane kept walking, guided by the hope that her friend's house would appear at any moment. She struggled to stay focused, but with each passing minute, her thoughts grew slower and more confused. Her body was starting to give in to the cold, but Jean wouldn't allow herself to quit. What she didn't know was that her destination was still miles away and that her body was already reaching its limit. Then, just a few steps from her goal, Jean's body could take no more. The extreme cold had drained all her energy. Her legs gave out and she collapsed into the snow unconscious. The silence of the night was broken only by the howling wind as Jean lay there, covered in a frozen shroud at the mercy of nature. She remained there for about 6 hours, frozen, just a few meters from the safety she so desperately sought. That decision to leave the car, though made with the best intentions, nearly cost her life. But Jean's story was far from over. The rescue. The next morning, the sun had barely risen on the horizon when Wally Nelson, Jean's friend, decided to leave his house. The landscape around was covered by a thick layer of snow with an absolute silence in the air, broken only by the soft sound of the wind. As he walked, Wally noticed something peculiar on the ground. Footprints in the snow. They were faint marks, almost erased by the snowstorm, but clearly recent. Intrigued, he decided to follow them, unaware of what he was about to discover. As he advanced, Wally began to feel an odd sense of urgency. The footprints seemed to lead him to something important. It was then then that, as he rounded a small bend in the rural road, he saw something that froze his heart. There, lying in a snow-covered ditch, was Jean Hilliard. But she no longer resembled the vibrant young woman he knew. Jean looked more like a block of ice than a person. Her body was completely rigid, as if every muscle had been petrified by the cold. Her once lively and rosy skin was now pale, almost translucent, with a whitish hue reminiscent of frozen meat. Her eyes, frighteningly open, stared blankly as if frozen in time, unable to see or feel anything. Wally felt a surge of despair. Everything suggested that Jean was beyond help, but driven by a mix of shock and instinct, he quickly crouched beside her. Touching her arm felt strange and alarming. Jean's body was so stiff and cold that it seemed impossible that there was still life within her. Nonetheless, Wally didn't give up. With great effort, he managed to lift Jean, realizing her frozen body was practically a solid block of ice. He carefully placed her in his car and, without wasting any time, drove as fast as he could to the nearest hospital, panic taking over his mind. Throughout the journey, Wally battled growing fear that his friend might already be dead and that every passing second was time lost. Upon arriving at the hospital, the medical team was stunned by what they saw. Jean was so hardened that a stretcher wasn't even needed to move her. They carried her like a piece of frozen meat, holding her by the shoulders and feet, and laid her on an emergency table. The scene was surreal. A young woman, frozen like a statue, was before them, with a pulse registering only 12 beats per minute, a sign of life so weak it was barely detectable. The doctors knew the chances of survival were virtually non-existent, but against all odds, they decided to fight to save Jean. What happened next is nothing short of a medical and human miracle. At the hospital. When Jean arrived at the hospital, her appearance left everyone stunned. Her body was completely rigid, as if sculpted from ice. Every joint, every muscle was hardened by the extreme cold. The medical team, accustomed to handling emergencies, had never seen anything like it. Jean looked more like a human ice block than a 19-year-old girl. She was so stiff that no stretcher was needed to move her. Two nurses simply lifted her by the shoulders and feet and carried her inside, as if she were a fragile statue. Dr. George Suter, the lead physician, examined Jean with a mix of shock and disbelief. Her pulse was practically imperceptible, registering only 12 beats per minute, a sign of life so weak it seemed like a distant echo, almost as if her body were in a state between life and death. Jean's body temperature was absurdly low, and given the circumstances, the medical team believed there was nothing more to be done. The faces of the doctors and nurses reflected the gravity of the situation. What they had in front of them was an almost insurmountable challenge. Jean was, for all intents and purposes, in a state of deep freezing. The prognosis was grim. Even if she miraculously survived, the chances of irreparable damage, such as the loss of limbs or severe brain damage, were extremely high. Despite this, Dr. Suter and his team decided they couldn't give up so easily. They immediately began the arduous process of trying to warm Jean's body using thermal blankets and electric blankets. The goal was to thaw her gradually and safely without causing further damage to her tissues. It was a race against time, a desperate attempt to reverse the near-death state Jean was in. As Jean's body began to warm slowly, the medical team watched closely for any signs of improvement. When they removed her clothes, they were alarmed to see that Jean's skin was completely black from the waist down, a clear sign of impending necrosis, where tissue dies due to lack of blood circulation. This indicated that, even if she survived, Jean would likely lose her legs. The doctors informed Jean's family of the seriousness of the situation. The chances of survival were minimal, and the few remaining odds pointed to a grim future for the young woman. But then, something incredible happened. Against all expectations, Jean began to show signs of life. A few hours after the warming process began, she started to move her lips and, surprisingly, attempted to speak. The medical team was shocked. It was as if Jean was coming back to life. As her body warmed, her heart rate began to stabilize, and her natural skin color slowly returned. Jean, who everyone believed to be in an irreversible state, was starting to react. The fight for Jean's life was far from over, but those first signs of recovery gave the medical team a renewed hope. What seemed like a lost cause began to turn into a medical miracle. Jean Hilliard was defying all odds, and her incredible survival journey was just beginning. The miracle. As the heat from the thermal and electric blankets began to take effect, Jean Hilliard's body, which seemed so lost to the cold, began to show signs of life. To everyone's surprise, Jean not only began to warm up, but almost unbelievably, her vital signs started to stabilize. A few hours into the warming process, something no one expected happened. Jean, who was practically frozen like an ice statue, opened her eyes. Initially, her words were incoherent, and she seemed to be trapped between consciousness and dreaming. The doctors were astonished. It was as as if they were witnessing a miracle before their eyes. That body, which minutes before was considered hopeless, was now responding to stimuli in an almost natural way. Jeanne, who moments earlier was as stiff as a rock, began to move her fingers and with difficulty tried to speak. Her lips, still numb, began to move, and soon after she managed to form complete sentences. The medical team could hardly believe it. Within a few hours, Jeanne was not only conscious, but also talking, asking where she was and what had happened. The recovery. Even with the most pessimistic expectations that she might lose her legs or suffer severe brain damage, Jeanne amazed everyone with her rapid recovery. Although she was still a bit confused and her body was still sore and rigid, she proved to be incredibly resilient. In that first week, Jeanne battled pain and fatigue, but each passing day made her stronger. The following weeks in the hospital were marked by a recovery that defied medical logic. Jeanne had to relearn to walk and needed intensive physical therapy, but by the end of 7 weeks, she was ready to go home. Her legs, which the doctors had believed would need to be amputated, were functioning normally, and her brain showed no signs of permanent damage. How did she survive? Jeanne Hilliard's case became a medical phenomenon, studied and discussed by experts around the world. How she managed to survive such an extreme situation without serious sequelae remains a mystery. Some doctors believe that the extreme cold, instead of killing her, put her body into a kind of temporary hibernation, reducing her vital functions to such a low level that she was able to survive until rescue. Cryogenics in the future. Jeanne Hilliard's extraordinary story not only amazes us with the incredible power of human survival, but also makes us reflect on futuristic possibilities like cryogenics. Cryogenics, or cryonic freezing, is a fascinating and controversial field based on the idea that by freezing a human body at extremely low temperatures, it is possible to preserve it for a future where it could be revived. So, folks, what did you think of this amazing story? Life can be surprising in ways we never imagined. If you liked the video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and share this incredible story with your friends. See you next time.